All right, so welcome to the Stafford Beer Brain of the Firm reading group with General Intellect Unit, session 13. This time we are finishing up the second half of chapter 11, Corporate Structure and its Quantification. So we are going to finish off the corporate structure part and then move on to the quantification part. So as for the corporate structure part, we made it to the notes on the divisional role in corporate organization last time, and we discussed the first of 3 points that Beer brings up. So you have operate within the intention of the whole organism, which we covered last time. Now, the second one is operate within the coordinating framework of System 2. And the third is submit to the automatic control of System 3 itself. So any thoughts on point 2, operate within the coordinating framework of System 2? We've got Shane. Go ahead.
It's interesting that Beer points out here that I think in his experience, one of the troubles with this is that it's very hard to get these leaders of the System 1 units to submit to the authority of a relatively junior system like System 2. Like it's easy to get them to kneel at the throne of System 5, but these like System 2 coordinating functions are relatively junior, and it's quite hard to convince these folks to in this like corporate business structure with its petty fiefdoms. Very hard to get them to submit to basic coordinating infrastructure.
Yeah, so Beer says in practice, the divisional chief executive must be dedicated to the effective running of his organization, of his division, as if his division were expected to overthrow the others in the competition for capital, for example. It follows that a measure of control must be vested in a corporate regulatory center charged with affecting the purposes of System 2. So danger points. Again, it's the duality of the roles within System 1 and System 5. And he says, to accept the regulatory action of a relatively junior control echelon at the corporate center is, in psychological terms this time, anathema. It is bad enough, feels the divisional chief executive, to accept instructions from above, System 5, given that this same man is party to such policy formulating in his other role. But the System 2 regulatory action is nothing more nor less than gross interference by people who do not know what they are talking about. Unless this problem can be overcome, then cybernetics safely predicts that the organization will go into a dramatic oscillation. So this idea that Beer mentions here is something I wasn't really aware of before. That a measure of control must be vested in a corporate regulatory center charged with affecting the purposes of System 2. Now, he says to look at figure 27 here, and you can see on there is the corporate regulatory center, but unfortunately that diagram is not labeled with which system each one belongs to.
I think that's System 2.
It's System 2. It's part of System 2. Top of System 2.
Yeah, it's like the top of the spinal column, or like so like on the right hand side of the diagram, you have the triangle bits, which are kind of like the ganglia that are off the side of the spinal column, and they're like the coupling from System 1 to System 2 in the particular. But then the corporate regulatory center is like System 2 in the general. It's like the nervous system at large, and it's like so it's, I think I would think of it as like the very top of the spinal column and the bottom of the brainstem.
Right, and then the operations directorate would be System 3, and the development directorate would be System 4. Okay, so that's interesting, because we usually think about System 2 as like peer-to-peer coordination. But actually, Beer suggests that an operations directorate is necessary, a coordination, corporate regulatory center is necessary.
Well, I guess it is peer-to-peer largely, but there's like a kind of some degree of, like, it's kind of like, in a peer-to-peer network, the network is an entity,
Yeah.
It's, so there's a sort of like, the sum of all peer-to-peer interactions, or like the policy of the peer-to-peer interactions, would be a kind of system 2 quasi-authority, but it doesn't seem to have this solid existence that systems 3, 4, and 5 have.
Okay, well, we'll see what he says in the rest of the book. So let's go to some other people here. Matt, Brett, Jeremy, and then Jake H.
Yeah, like people, kind of not wanting to submit to System 2. Make me think of how, when I think of, like System 2s that, easily come to mind, a lot of them are just automated, like Jira, or, like in People's Republic of Walmart, when they talk about the automated inventory management systems, it's something that, like you can't actually argue with it, or like maybe you can like raise some kind of algorithmic alert, but, like it's actually hard to do that. It's a fait accompli, like you can't really negotiate.
Right. So perhaps engineering around that problem, by making it, a rather obstinate machine.
If we're looking at this from a Marxist perspective, we need to look at attempted communist and socialist revolutions and what happened there. And to me, when I look at this description of coordinating System 2s, who was like in the the Russian Empire was completely massive. It was the largest physical territory in the world, and basically run by bureaucrat logistics, where there was a bureaucratic caste, there was a 14-step ranking system that basically weeded out around loyalty to the Tsar, and ultimately most intellectuals washed out of that system because it was designed to wash them out. And then you have the Communist Party or the Bolshevik Party stepping in to all of these places, but understanding that the logistics were so complicated, they needed to keep the old networks of Tsarist bureaucracy and to sort of Bolshevize them. And you get this sense, the whole idea of resenting newbies coming in and telling people what to do is a huge part of massive bureaucratic failures in the 20s, because you'd get these very well-read, nerdy Bolsheviks making their way to Omsk or Magnitogorsk and having everyone being like, "You are stupid, you do not understand our world," and then just, everything just sort of falling apart. I think the Soviets never really got a handle on that, and especially, the Chinese situation was a little bit different, but you look at the Great Leap Forward and you see another example of attempts to throw in a System 2 process just colossally failing.
Right. This is a very important point. Because as we sort of seen earlier in the text, it's perfectly understandable and expected that you are going to get this kind of resistance whenever you make change in an organization. So have to accept it's going to happen. Okay, let's go back to Brett and then to Jake H.
Can you hear me now? It's better? Okay. So what I was saying is I feel like if you automate too much of System 2 or you try to do the wrong solution to System 2, you get the problem that was also mentioned in People's Republic of Walmart, where you've just got markets and you literally have the company competing against itself to just like basically eat itself up, which is what Beer is saying here. Is like if you've got like if you're competing for other resources with other firms, like it's just gonna eat itself up.
Right. Indeed. So yeah, that system that Sears implemented was just catastrophically bad. So let's go to Jake H.
Yeah, I think I definitely like the question of like how do you get the System 1 to kind of obey the commands of System 2, or like I don't know, maybe that's too like harsh a word or whatever, but like be influenced by. is, I think, a really important question. And maybe it'll be answered a bit more in the next chapter. Maybe just getting more of a sense of like what in practice those systems look like. But I think, because I think it's this very like, I don't know if it's just capitalist or if it's like a holdover from feudalism and all those other things of just like this idea of like, well, what we have here is working for us, so therefore why should we need to change it? And I think that maybe it requires just more buy-in, requires kind of a better understanding of the whole picture, I guess, which maybe speaks to kind of the idea of what's sort of been thrown around a little bit on the Discord of like getting people to be able to shuffle between the different systems and not like not specify as those to like a specific person. Because like if the people kind of in the system 5 of the system 1 are also have some overlap with the system 2, I think he's saying that before, like it can work better than you might expect it to work just because there's able to be that crosstalk that you wouldn't have otherwise. So I think it's pretty interesting and also definitely like, he talks about like the psychological effect of that, like not letting someone else tell you what to do with like what's yours or what they have control over, I suppose is definitely something, like that has been a problem with all previous attempts at socialism and communism. And I think technology could be a way out of it, not necessarily like totally automating system 2, but just like having those automated controls to like make it a little easier for someone to like understand why the system 2 is saying do this thing, or understand that there's no like person in system 2 who's trying to like take over the role of the person or the people who are in nominally control of the system 1, making it more of like, well, you're part of this larger structure and therefore like it's in your best interest to do this. And I just some thoughts about how to implement that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably useful to have the system 2 algorithmics sort of graphically represented for everyone, so that you can they can kind of see where the stress points are happening in the overall system, and it's not just someone using bureaucratic advantage to browbeat them into doing something that doesn't make sense. Rudy, you had something to say?
I'll pass.
Okay. So we'll move on then. Again, this is a point that Beer brings up, offers a kind of a solution, but we're going to need to see what exactly he expects out of this regulatory center, the corporate regulatory center, in further work. Okay, so we move on to point 3, submit to the automatic control of System 3 itself. The internal homeostasis of the corporation is not simply a matter of preventing oscillation, which is a System 2 undertaking. If corporate synergy is to be achieved at all times, which is to say throughout current operations, then sometimes the needs of one division must be sacrificed, not to the needs of the corporation, which is another point dealt with under System 5, but explicitly to the needs of other divisions. The difficulties implicit here are well exemplified in many large organizations by the problem of transfer prices. So this is going to be kind of like if you have an internal market inside your corporation, what prices are set to exchange goods between divisions. It follows from this objectively, quote-unquote, obvious constraint that a division may even be asked by the others to go into liquidation. Why not? It may well be inimical to the optimal behavior of other divisions simply as a matter of practical day-to-day operations, and regardless of the role of such a maverick division in a perfectly viable long-term corporate plan. There is a conflict of values here which can be resolved in logic only at the top. Okay, so anything to say about point 3, the automatic control of System 3. Shane, go ahead.
This notion of like liquidating one of the System 1s kind of reminded me of when we had that discussion with Lumio, and they were saying that they're an example probably of like the good version of this, like a healthy version of this, where, you know, they would do their collective planning and decide to take a punt on a project, and they would give it a month or 2 months or whatever to see if it pans out. And then if it doesn't pan out, they can, you know, discuss and decide, okay, we'll just shut that down and do something else. And because Lumio has that kind of rather healthy kind of horizontal structure where nobody's like livelihood is really at stake from that liquidation, that then becomes possible to just shut down a project and shift the resources around, hopefully without anyone's egos getting too bruised in the process. I think that they're a pretty good example of that in a positive sense.
Yeah, they talked about how you know, there needs to be that material support for people shifting their priorities, but there also needs to be a certain amount of emotional maturity among workers in abandoning work when the priorities of the organization shift. So this would be like if in the course of a sprint, it becomes obvious that one task is not contributing to the overall sprint goals, then people need to be able to drop that task, even if they've invested a lot of time and energy in making sure it's good work. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the quality of the work. It has to do with the coherence of the project. Okay, so we'll go to Jake and then back to Shane.
Yeah, I think, like, speaking on this, I think it definitely does speak to emotional maturity, like, and just, like, willingness to, like, set aside maybe whatever personal feelings you had of, like, investing in the project. But just, like, thinking about, like, ways that projects or System 1s, whatever, can kind of be, like, put on hold in a way, or put into kind of a more of a stasis than into, like, complete liquidation, is, I think, one way around it. But, like, that's helpful, I think, for people who have put time into something. I'm just thinking about, like, in terms of an example for my own organization, like, we set up a mutual aid project when COVID started. Now that things aren't as bad, and I mean, I would say that government stepped in a little bit, but it hasn't really stepped in at all. But just, like, the economy is opening up a little bit, so it's less, the needs are different and they're shifting, and so we don't do it the same way because the material conditions have changed. And I think that's, like, you know, a testament, I think, to how we're able to shift that. But just, like, it can be done in a way that doesn't require, like, all this work that you put into it no longer applicable, but just, like, have the skeleton around and ready to go back up again if the needs exist again, as I think. Like, I don't think not everything needs to be completely liquidated. Obviously, can be different when you talk about, like, a company where it's just much easier to just have that top down, like, okay, we're not putting the money into this thing anymore, but it's more of like a volunteer basis, then it can be done in a different way, I guess.
Well, I think Beer here is talking about the extreme case, right, where it is appropriate to completely liquidate the System 1, but that's really the extreme case. It's not necessarily the regular case. It's just kind of the one that would be the most provocative and generating conflict. So yeah, I mean, I think that's fair, though. Like, it's always good to first keep in mind, like, should these operations just be scaled back? Should they be rescheduled? Should they be modified before saying, like, let's just cut the whole division? For sure. Okay, Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Jake's example was actually really good there, right? That, like, that's a healthy way of doing it, where the material conditions change and you decide you like examine the evidence. And it's like, okay, we don't need to do that anymore, or we don't need to do it to the same degree, so we put this on ice or whatever. In terms of that kind of, like, socialist organizing stuff, we can also imagine, like, the pathological cases where institutions or organizations kind of refuse to stand down, like, union apparatus that ends up opposing socialism or like working against the workers, because if full communism was achieved, their jobs would be irrelevant, or their positions of prestige would be irrelevant. And this is the tension of the interaction between the systems 1 and the system 3, right? That like, because each of the system 1 units are autopoietic viable systems, they have a self-perpetuating loop, because they have to, right? If they're autopoietic, they have to have some drive to self-perpetuate. But they also do need to submit to a higher collective authority that can rule on whether that system needs to exist anymore, or whether it's an obstruction, perhaps, to the greater good. And yeah, I think just to touch back on the Lumio thing, like it's a really good example of how, if you decouple people's material interests, like their wage or their livelihood, from their membership in any particular system, it becomes much easier to be able to just shut down a project without chucking someone out on the streets at the same time.
Yeah, definitely. And that's been for a long time one of the arguments in favor of socialism, which is that it's easier to move people around without causing huge distress and disruption in their lives. Right. And, we can see examples like this where, for example, like, maybe the cop unions need to be kicked out of the AFL-CIO. But that's really hard to do because they're a very large unionized group. And they do have their own divisional autonomy within that organization. So now we'll get on to the danger point for this, which is considerably longer than the others. So he says, however, I say again, however, the very possibility that this demand for dissolution or contraction might happen to any division of the corporation constitutes an omnipresent threat in the minds of many divisional directorates. They therefore act as if they were threatened with extinction and become aggressive to fellow divisions when all the evidence shows that they ought to be cooperative. It seems ironic that we should say, we cannot discuss the division because it is no more nor less than the whole in microcosm, and then go on to say many things about the divisional role in the enterprise. So this is getting back to that general character of the VSM. The reason for this apparent inconsistency is the chief lesson worth learning, and it emerges from the notes under each of the 3 danger point headings above. To the divisional chief executive and his divisional directorate, it is always true that things are not what they seem. This is essentially because of the duality of roles, on which comment has already been passed. But even if we were to forbid divisional chiefs from participating in corporate endeavors, the result would be the same. This draws attention to a weakness in our model. The units of the body politic are themselves self-conscious. Therefore, even if the people concerned at the divisional level are excluded, quite formally, from corporate management, nothing on earth can prevent them from deliberating on the nature and behavior of the corporation as such. It is as if the heart were given a little mind of its own, with which to ask whether the whole body were behaving so badly that it, the heart, might end up with coronary thrombosis. Just think of what a threat this suspicion would constitute to the heart as a major organ of the body. Before long, it would come to suspect the liver and the kidneys of unthinkable perfidy, whereas those blameless organs were without fault in submitting to the 3 constraints constituting their own autonomic limitation. This is a thought-provoking reflection. The psychiatric problems of organs endowed with self-consciousness would be legion. Thus, in some ways, our liberal-minded and culturally sophisticated attempts to involve divisional managements more and more in corporate policies may be asking for trouble. But please do not take the remark too seriously. Given that divisional directorates comprise people, there is probably no doubt that maximum participation offers the best solution. If these head scratchings reveal anything at all, it is that participatory management, divisional vis-a-vis corporate, may raise more problems than it solves, and does, at the very least, depend heavily on the full-time awareness of all concerned that their roles are indeed dual. This means that what the cortex self-consciously knows may be death to the autonomic system, This means that what the cortex self-consciously knows may be deaf to the autonomic system, a most unphysiological state of affairs. All right, so any comments on this section, the contradictions of self-conscious organs? Jake H., go ahead.
Yeah, this is definitely like him finally admitting, like, well, maybe it's not fully one-to-one with the body, but, you know, there's still some value in that. And I think it's definitely, like, gets to that kind of recursiveness of the VSM, like, that each of these parts aren't just, like, they're not just automatons. They're, like, their own self-contained kind of viable systems, and therefore they might have different, like, different ideas about how things should be run. And yeah, I think I like what he says about that the more participation, the better, even though this might raise a whole new set of concerns, and maybe it wouldn't be good in the way that we think it should be good. But I think, like, ultimately, if we want a socialist society, if we want a communist society, like, we're going to have to take on the problems that come with having a lot of people involved with making a lot of the decisions of society. And I think, like, that ultimately is, like, those are the growing pains, right, that we're going to have to go through as we transition from capitalism to, like, a new form of society. But I think also, like people now, you know, don't want necessarily to be involved with every decision-making process. Like, even just like I'm my own struggles in trying to increase participation in our organization, of just, like, people that don't want to have to check websites every few days to make sure they're on top of decisions that need to be made. Like, people just want to know, like, okay, I don't have to think about this, and, like, it'll get done. And I think that's fine. But I think also it's worth thinking about, like, what can be done to, like, not allow for, like, passive participation, because that's kind of already there, but just, like, allow for active participation in a way that doesn't require, like, a huge amount of thought and energy, and, like, that kind of anxiety that some people can get of, like, oh, well, I've got a notification waiting for me. I'm not going to open up the notification because I don't want to have to think about what I have to do when I realize what it's. So it's like, I don't know a great way around that, but it's definitely something to think about. And I like that Beer's raising these points because they're important.
Definitely. Yeah, we can see that, like, in some ways, the kind of dictatorial management style actually more closely approximates the body, because it organizes people in the way that it tries to suppress their capacity for autonomous thinking about the organization. Now, of course, it's not successful entirely doing that, because people are still people, as Beer is saying here. But, you know, this thing where every organ of the body is a thinking organ, and that being a potential problem, is sort of a problem that, like, conventional management theory intuits and tries to suppress. So that is a very interesting point. And it's like, you know, that way in which Beer is kind of both analogizing between the body and the organization, and then also trying to qualify those analogies in terms of the ways that doesn't make sense. It leads to a pretty tricky understanding. Okay, Brett, go ahead.
But I'd even argue, though, that metaphor does make sense, because it can happen that the body does things that are against the nature of what the body is. Like, it doesn't have, the organs do operate independently of each other, and that can cause problems. and thinking about that in terms of like what sort of messaging we can have to make sure that doesn't happen, right? Because it is very top down, but it's also organs still can do their own thing. And I would love for my brain to be able to tell my body to say, hey, stop growing bone there. But it's not going to work because there's just no way to do that, internally at least.
Yeah, it's not that organs have a certain degree of autonomy that's the issue that Beer's pointing to. It's that people have a holistic conception of the organization in a way that organs don't. I think that's what he's getting at, because he does acknowledge that, like, yeah, organs have autonomy and they're going to lead into conflict with each other. That's part of the body. That's part of physiology. The thing that organs don't have is, like, their own brain that allows them to build a sort of holistic picture. Shane, go ahead.
Or even just message back and forth with each other, yeah.
Yeah. I think this reminds me of a point I think I raised maybe a couple of sessions ago, that there's, like, as we go up the layers of emergence of, like, biological systems and organic systems and so on, there's this repetition of control structures, but a sort of escalation in degrees of self-reflexivity that, you know, the organs are somewhat self-reflexive. They have internal control structures to keep their own maintenance, and then you get to the level of the organism. But then when you get up to, like, social organisms and social systems that organisms participate in, each unit participates in many systems in a way that a heart doesn't. Like, a heart doesn't jump between bodies in the same way that a person jumps between vital systems. Like, if a person is in a family and works 2 jobs, at a minimum, they're in 3 things that would qualify as a viable system. And their self-reflexivity gives us the ability to compare notes across these systems and to see and observe things in ways that the organs of the body or even the cells can't do. So I think that, like, the difference in degree of reflexivity gives rise to a difference in kind at this kind of level, where I think what Stafford is kind of talking around here is that the analogy kind of starts to break down because of that difference in kind. That there is something that social organisms can do that cells and organs can't.
Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, Lumio gives a really interesting example, or not Lumio, I'm sorry, Inspiral gives a really interesting example of killing one of its own system ones with the workspace. They had a co-working space, and they got rid of it. And they got rid of it because collectively they all decided that the job of maintaining a co-working space sucked and they didn't like it. And I think one thing that helps is everyone being conscious of being part of System 5. If you have a situation where people are shut out of System 5 completely, and then System 5 liquidates their division, they're incredibly, intensely upset and angry about it because they see it as unjust. That one of the ways you fix this is train everybody in the system to understand they're going to be wearing multiple hats on the one hand, and on the other hand, letting them know that these sort of liquidations aren't going to result in them being out of the company or out of the system. I have a friend who was unemployed for a very long time, and he finally got a contract gig, and 3 weeks later, it was just liquidated. It was incredibly frustrating. It took him another 2 years. He finally got one, and earlier this week, he was really upset because it turned out that his project was being terminated early, and then he just posted on Facebook joyously yesterday that the group he joined pays everyone full-time wages until they can get them back on another project. He'd never heard of that even being a thing, couldn't have imagined that he was in such a system, and so he was terribly, terribly upset. And then once he found out that he was going to be spending the next N weeks doing Python training while waiting for the next gig, he was delighted. And there's no reason we couldn't set up work that way. It just There's really no reason. I mean, people, any HR director is going to just, bloviate about how important human capital is. But human capital actually is really, really important. And, it would be very easy to imagine a system where you remain part of the organization, and something like redundancy of a particular project doesn't factor into that.
Yeah, I mean, unemployment insurance is supposed to kind of fulfill that role in a sense between organizations, but it's very, very partially applied, and it never really provides a real sense of security. Just an aside about NSpiral. The NSpiral Dev Academy, where I met the Lumio people for the interview, is mainly like a kind of hacker camp. That's its main function. But it also functions as a co-working space that Lumio works in. And they have meeting rooms and stuff in there. So even though that System 1 was liquidated, it was sort of later rolled into another function, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, it can be a kind of in and out process over time. All right, so let's move on then. So we are now looking at the second section of the chapter, notes on the measures of achievement. So this second section of the chapter is largely disconnected from the first, but maybe we can draw some connections between them. Okay, so first of all, Buer says, the dynamics of this whole structure depend on the quantification of its performance. Hitherto, business has used the measure of money, cost, and sales price, the direction and rate of cash flow. Thus, we have come to identify the quantification of business activity and the corporations we already know with the cost accounting function. This is because cost accountancy provides a lingua franca by which the disparate activities of unlike divisions may be compared and aggregated. So this is, of course, the classic Austrian school point about the coordinating role of money. There is no reason why this should be so, beyond its historicity and alleged familiarity. So Buer is contesting this point. Secondly, insofar as there is an observable trend in the corporations we already know, it is towards the construction of massive databases within divisional centers on which it is claimed corporate management will be able to draw for every purpose under heaven. This development has been attacked in previous chapters from many angles. People are already finding it inoperable and certainly uneconomic. But the most important argument against the approach is that it rides on hidden premises about computational capabilities which cannot be fulfilled, as was argued in Chapter 3. Then what should we do? From the corporate standpoint, divisional performance is about both short-term and long-term viability. The notion that cost should be minimized or profit maximized within a fixed epoch leaves right out of the count other factors which are vital to the future viability of the business contained within the division. They are the latent capabilities of the firm, which may be built up and metabolized by wise management or squandered recklessly by stupid management, without in either case procuring a change which is reflected in costings. For costings are short-term control instruments and will not detect the mismanagement of latent resources. By definition, this mismanagement will not be detected until it is too late, though through the financial accounts, no doubt, although it is happening now and ought to be checked. We need a measure of achievement which is both less loaded in terms of the emotional appeal of profits, and which is also more comprehensive in terms of the real resources at risk. The measure must nonetheless be expressed in a common metric for the whole corporation. If money is not the unit, then we must think in terms of pure numbers. There is a classic measure of productivity which can be extended. It expresses the ratio of what is possible to what is actual. Thus, if a typist could type 100 pages in a given time, but types only 50, then her productivity over the period is clearly 1/2. 0.5 is a pure number. Now we may deal with the problem of incorporating latent resources by a slight elaboration of this theme, which requires us to identify 3 rather than 2 levels of achievement. They are actuality. This is simply what we are managing to do now with existing resources under existing constraints. Capability. This is what we could be doing still right now with existing resources under existing constraints if we really worked at it. And potentiality. This is what we ought to be doing by developing our resources and removing constraints, although still operating within the bounds of what is already known to be feasible. It would help a lot to fix these definitions clearly in the mind. So, anything to say about this section? Shane, go ahead.
I think my first remark is that the connection between these halves is that the whole chapter is about System 1, and that in these capitalist firms, those 3 points we just covered, like, operating within the intention of the organism, coordinating with other sub-units, and whatever the fuck the third point was, they are all related to performance. Like, performance is the way, or measures of achievement are the way by which the rest of the system would determine whether those 3 points are being met. Anyway, on the content of the actual thing, though, I think this like 3 levels of achievement is really interesting, and it's this step beyond like capitalist investment, right? Where you just have this like constant grind to move actuality towards capability, right? Like just pure productivity. Introducing the third term, though, and especially like it's a third term that is what we ought to be doing, which is a kind of collective, ethical, and socially determined sort of objective. That's the step beyond capitalist investment circuits towards something that's much more kind of socially ambitious and isn't just a kind of blind repetition function of reinvestment and grinding on productivity.
Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say, like, sure, this felt disjoint from while I was reading this chapter, but like as soon as we get into the next chapter, it becomes very clear what this stuff is, because these are quite literally and as simply like the outputs of System 1, like mathematically speaking. And it sort of gets to just my general comments about how he describes this is he has such a tendency to go into long verbose explanations of this stuff when it's like it's right there just to identify these concepts with the numbers and the math that are actually laid on top of all of these diagrams. And I assume other people have done it since, I don't know, but certainly as we get into the next chapter where we're really talking about how the math works, and he hints at it. It's like, oh, here's a Gaussian probability distribution, and you want to look at statistical significance. But it's just like, well, put it on the diagram or make it more explicit on how that works. And I think this here is like, oh, I forgot we need to define the actual terms that are coming out of System 1. So I talked about System 1, and then, this is the output. But he weirdly just never really says it in a direct way. And it took to the next chapter to figure that out.
Right. So for myself, I think the thing that really sticks out to me is like he asserts that productivity is a commensurate value between different kinds of work. And I'm interested to what extent that's true. I don't think it's necessarily wrong. It's just certainly a controversial statement that he's making here about planning, where many people would disagree with him on that. Now, Jeremy and then Rudy, go ahead.
I didn't get the sense that productivity is ratios between different things, but productivity is ratios inside the same metric. So, if you have a list of 14 things that you're measuring, for each thing, you're coming up with 3 scalars. There's a actuality scalar, a capability scalar, and a potentiality scalar. So I got the sense that these ratios are ratios within each measured quantity rather than across different ones.
That's true in the first instance, but he does say the measure must nonetheless be expressed in a common metric for the whole corporation. So he says in terms of pure numbers. So, you know, I don't think this is necessarily untrue so long as, like, the formulation of the metrics is worked out through the cooperation of many people taking in the situation of the corporation. Because I'm not a Hayekian in that way. Like, I don't think that it can only really happen behind people's backs in sort of an unconscious way. I think Neurath was more correct on this point. But the fact that Beer is using sort of like idiosyncratic productivity metrics that are set by individual system ones, as opposed to using like labor time as a common metric, is really interesting to me. I don't know if it works or not, but it's really interesting as like a kind of like more rich metric or sort of system of metrics than what you might get with simply labor time accounting. Rudy, go ahead.
Yeah, I was actually going to talk a bit about that, but I think he just hit all the main points, so I'm going to pass.
Okay, sure thing. Okay, all right, let's move on then. So we've got the 3 metrics. Now, of course, we may project our future plans on the basis of any one of these notions of achievement, or indeed have 3 sets of plans which separately employ these 3 criteria. Again, it will pay to assimilate the following definitions. Planning on the basis of actuality, I call programming. Planning on the basis of capability, I call planning by objectives. Planning on the basis of potentiality, I call normative planning. The first of these is simply a program because it accepts the inevitable shortcomings of the situation and does not admit that anything can imminently be done about them. Programming is a tactical ruse. We move to genuine planning only when we set new objectives and try to achieve them. This is the strategic planning level. So, you know, obviously Beer's military background coming in here with the difference between tactics and strategy. Normative planning sets potentiality as its target and incurs major risks and penalties, although it also offers major and perhaps decisive benefits. But however we plan, what really matures is always called actuality, and the measures of achievement proposed relate capability and potentiality to whatever may be actual at the time. Here are some more definitions. Productivity is the ratio of actuality and capability. Latency is the ratio of capability and potentiality. And performance is both the ratio of actuality and potentiality, and also the product of latency and productivity. Okay, so actuality over potentiality, and also the product of latency and productivity. Okay. These relationships are laid out in figure 28, which is fortunately a much better diagram than 27. The behavior of ratios is a strange phenomenon, and figure 28 repays a good deal of contemplation. If full achievement is to be read as unity, that is 100%, the smaller of the two raw measures must always be the numerator and the larger the denominator. It is not possible to write down these pairs of terms as one over another, because which way up the fraction is written depends on the measures one is using. Potentiality is always better than capability, which is always better than actuality. But if we are talking about profit, for example, better means more, whereas if we talk about the number of men required to do a job, better means less. The second point to note is that the overall measure of performance is determined by the ratio of actuality and potentiality as being two extremes. This means that capability is floating between them and can change without affecting either. All right, so a lot of definitions here, just a huge dump of definitions and relations. Any comments? Questions about this section? Okay. So consider then the question of what happens to the achievement indices when we go on doing what we have always done. Note, nothing changes in the cost report. When the ultimate possibilities remain the same. Note, nothing changes in the corporate view of R&D. But where divisional management acts to change the capability. This it may do by undertaking work study of processes, negotiating new agreements with the unions, raising the morale or improving the quality of managers, and so forth. Clearly, the overall performance index does not change. What happens is that the latency measure improves, because capability is approaching potentiality, and productivity is lowered. But if potent management can in these circumstances improve the actual performance, as obviously it should, all three measures of achievement will rise. These are the kind of measures that we need, and they may be applied in general to divisional performance or in particular to individual activities. They may be applied segmentally to various aspects of work, to the effort of the labor force, for instance, and to the technological capacities of plant. In that case, these segmental indices may subsequently be multiplied together to provide an overall performance measure, which is consistent with its direct computation from the raw data. However it is done, and indeed the doing may involve work study and operational research on a considerable scale, the resulting measures are simple and easy to use. After all three measures of achievement should be rising. Anything to say about this section? Go ahead, Jeremy.
This is a bit mathy, but Beer talks about how he actually handles these ratios when they get entered into a computer, and says that they're going to get hit with an inverse sine function. And an inverse sine function, the slope gets higher and higher as you get closer to 1. And I think it's a normalized inverse sine. So I think, like, instead of having a ceiling of pi over 2, it has a ceiling of 1. And he never really says why he did it in Cybersyn, but that, everyone agreed that, hitting this thing with the inverse sine made it work. And so I think that's worth pondering, math people. Like, why were these stats sort of massaged using an inverse sine function?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I have no idea. He seems very...
Is the sine function not to squash it into a range? Am I misunderstanding that?
Well, it's an inverse sine function. Inverse sine functions take a number between -1 and 1, and then they spit out a number between negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2. But of course, all these ratios are positive, so it's really between 0 and pi over 2, except it's normalized, so it's between 0 and 1. But for some reason, that smoothing out of the data would, I would say, push things sort of more towards the center, so that if people were really coming up with these ratios very close to 1, they would sort of get smoothed down a bit. Not sure why I did it.
Okay.
I guess if that's the case, it may just have something to do with the fact that these values are always going to be rising, ideally. And so you might not want to have your indicator kind of crushed up near 1. It might be easier to track that way. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add that, like, these sort of specific decisions that he makes for various filtering and smoothing, it's, on one hand, like, it's good that he's acknowledging it and talking about it, and it is very much the sort of thing that often gets, like, just washed away in technical papers, like when I read things that aren't at all comparable as like integration or implementation details that don't really have to do much with the actual computation of the things that matter, which in this case would be like those metrics. So like I do absolutely appreciate that he's very explicit about the fact that you do have to do the massaging and filtering and smoothing pretty much every step of the way. What's missing here is, as you said, like, why? You know, why did he choose this function over another one? And like, you know, a good analysis would show that, you know, if you use, I don't know, something else, that gives you the sort of performance that you want. I mean, there's clearly something if it is, and, you know, I haven't gotten to part 4, like, oh, for CyberSyn, this is the thing that worked the best. Like, there was clearly a reason why that performance, like, was better than other things they probably tried. So, like, that's an interesting question in and of itself. But it is, you know, it's part of the integration and implementation details. So I'm glad he's talking about it. But yeah, we still, like, this probably isn't the right place to talk about why all those decisions were made there.
Right. And I mean, like, you can still, like, go and do, like, A/B testing to decide what is the best way to represent this data. Like, it's not like it's sort of a unique situation lost to time that we can't re-examine to try to figure out. But it's too bad that, like, it wasn't explained. Anyway, let's continue. Here we finally detect the manager who is doing most these days to wreck industrial enterprise. He is the irresponsible cost cutter. Note, this does not say that cutting costs is irresponsible. The manager I speak of raises productivity and hopefully profits, and thereby acquires a marvelous reputation, not by increasing actual achievement, but by lowering capability. He does by squandering his latent resources. He cuts budgets. He lets go valuable men. He fails to implement research results should this involve the slightest effort, expenditure, or risk. Thus, he triumphs as a tough, practical man. In the orthodox scheme of reporting, no measure will reveal the damage he is doing. There is no element in either the profit and loss account or the balance sheet which declares him to be murdering the company's reputation in markets for products, for supplies, or for staff, which may well be needed in a few years' time. The proposed indices do reveal this. Consider what will happen in the case quoted. The manager's productivity will be seen to increase, for indeed it does increase, and that doubtless means that this year's profits will rise. But his latency index will deteriorate, and so probably will his overall performance. So keep your eye on profits in a few years' time. I like this description of the reckless cost cutter. It kind of reminds me of like the modern major general. Anyway, Figure 20 Died details a few quite dissimilar applications of these achievement measures. The examples demonstrate the versatility of the scheme, which could be applied to any endeavor, given suitable definitions of the three initial terms. Here again, it is a useful exercise to contemplate each of the examples in turn, working out for oneself what are the consequences of various possible actions. There can be no argument about the numbers used to measure actuality. There will be severe arguments about the other two sets of numbers. But if we use good operational research, it becomes possible to gain agreement that the numbers used are sensible, and the process of investigation and discussion is itself highly beneficial. What matters is that capability and potentiality measures, though somewhat arbitrarily fixed, cannot then be arbitrarily changed, as, is so common in, state socialism, right? Constantly changing the numbers, so you didn't lose your job or get your head cut off or shot or whatever. Hence, although the absolute values of the productivity and latency indices provide only approximate assessments, movements of these indices over time provide the information that we really need. So it's really the directionality of your vector that matters when someone else is reviewing the data, or when you're reviewing it for your personal use in a system one. We can look at these examples in figure 29, maybe. So the first one is setting general divisional targets. And in the inputs are 40,000 pounds actuality, 60,000 pounds capability, and 100,000 pounds potentiality. So the productivity measure is 40 over 60, 0.67. So they're doing 0.67 of their potential productivity, which would be unity. And then they have the latency measure, which is 60 over 100, or 0.6, which is that's the capability over the potentiality. Then you go on, multiply latency by productivity, and you get 0.4, which is your... Now, what's that final metric what did he call that? Performance?
Yeah.
Yeah, performance.
That's your 40,000 versus 100,000.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That all makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now, there's also on the left-hand side of this diagram, normative planning being the highest potentiality, planning by objectives or strategic planning being the middle one, and then programming being tactics or tactical, and that being the lowest one. So just showing that, the reason why these numbers are laid out in the way they are on the diagram. Okay, so the next one is monitoring technical performance in units per hour. And then the final one is monitoring labor performance, men required on the job, which I guess is, in more modern parlance, like workforce utilization or employment. Like, I guess if you're talking about your overall workforce, and then how many should be on a shift, or how many shifts you need to have, it would be this kind of question. Shane, go ahead.
I'm thinking back to the time we were talking to Tom O'Brien about planning and labor time calculation, and I really want to see an application of this kind of model of potentiality, capability, and actuality applied to that sort of thing, or just like see those things integrated into each other. So it feels like there's really... It feels like some of what Stafford is kind of talking around here is this kind of like, labor values sort of stuff, but it's not really explicit, or maybe it's not even explicit for him. It's just kind of implicit. But I'd love to see this properly Marxified, you know?
Well, I think it's less the case that Beer is not talking about labor time, and it's more the case that Cockshot collapses the multidimensional nature of Neurath's planning method into the various input and output, the various input values, the material balances in linear programming. So you're saying, like, Cockshot sort of says, because you have different kinds of things, because you are planning in natura, you are therefore kind of doing a more rich and multidimensional form of plan than a simple costing through monetary profit and loss would do. But I think what Beer's proposing here is actually closer to what Neurath was trying to say in terms of, like, having a system of planning that really does take into account quite distinct metrics, which sure. Labor time planning doesn't. You need to have, like, a separate system which is going to adjust labor time planning in terms of sort of like a broader comprehension of reality. Yeah. So Rudy, you had something to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, thinking of this, and like you're saying, Cockshot really contracts all this again to a single number, which is, it's a different number, but it is a single number. And, you know, something like the Jason Moore analysis of at least like 4 types of flows in the sense of nature, labor, food, and I don't remember the other one. I feel like that would be such a massive improvement over just a single number. But then again, the advantage of collapsing to a single number is that then you don't have to make decisions, right? It's just a single number. When you have 3 or 4, you have to somehow ponder them.
Yeah, well, you know, in Cockshot's scheme, you get the labor time accounting, and then you have a democratic body elected by sortition that reviews packages, or baskets of different goods, or different production plans, essentially, and uses like their kind of like more rich cognitive capabilities to revise or like to choose between different combinations of outcomes. So it can't, like, even Cockshot acknowledges that it cannot be reduced simply to minimizing or like improving labor productivity, the least labor for the most product. So there will be disagreement, but the multidimensional nature of the thing is kind of post hoc, whereas this is kind of operating on both sides. And that's quite interesting. Yeah, and it does sort of rhyme with what Neurath was saying about how you need all of these different kinds of democratic bodies that have their own sort of concerns and their own ways of life, and they need to be able to evaluate production in terms of their own values to have an actually democratic planning system. Which kind of like, you know, overlaps with the idea of System 1 autonomy. Yeah, cool. I don't know. It's an interesting idea. Anything further to say about this section? Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, these 3 metrics and their ratios are so strange that you kind of wish that there were detailed case histories of using those metrics and what happened when they did. You know, if any of us were to become resident Stafford beer experts and consult with a company that wanted to use the Stafford beer method, would we push these metrics? And if so, what would happen? Like, those are really unknown questions. I mean, what we might want to do is something parallel. We use a more traditional approach on top of this and see which one gives better metrics, you know, sort of an A-B switch kind of testing, but the fact that this was used in CyberSyn at every level of recursion is really, really interesting. And I see nothing in the literature. Eden Medina doesn't talk about this. I've seen nothing in the literature about how well did these metrics work at analyzing a multi-step recursive system. I'm fascinated to know what happened.
Yeah, definitely. So we're running up on time. So quick comments. Sorry I went so long. Brett, Matt, and then Shane.
Yeah, I'm curious about that too, because I'm not convinced we can always calculate what the potential at productivity even is, especially in like software or other fields. That's always been a tricky thing in terms of figuring out what even is productivity in those fields.
Absolutely. It's a classic problem, well known. So yeah, even the process of calculation, estimation, what are the operation research methods that Beer is alluding to here, all that stuff is very interesting. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, like the section was I had a complicated reaction to it, because on the one hand, like in Cybernetic Revolutionaries, it just sort of alludes. It just sort of alludes to the KPIs and how they spent months figuring them out, and it figured, like Beer has to have like a method for doing this, and so it was cool to actually see it, or at least part of it, but also this seems a little, but I guess the fact that it's so abstract also kind of makes sense, because that means that you can apply it to more or less anything, and I wouldn't be surprised if certain kinds of work actually maybe even don't even manifest in a way that you can measure directly with these. I imagine so for differences between actuality and potential, I imagine a lot of that the investigations will point to bottlenecks, and maybe you don't measure IT or software stuff in terms of lines of code written or features delivered or anything, but your IT systems that are reducing bottlenecks and other things. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Shane, I believe, I don't know, it was somebody mentioned that Beer suggests that these need to be set by the system ones themselves. And so you're not going to end up with a metric like lines of code, because coders just wouldn't do that. That's something a manager would do that doesn't understand coding and would just be desperate to come up with a measurement that they can use to discipline the workforce. But what the metrics would be is something I'd be very interested in. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah. I think it is. It certainly comes up in Beer. I think that these need to be set by the system ones themselves, or negotiated with between the system one and the higher system. And yeah, from my experience in working in software, there's a lot of stuff that's extremely hard to quantify. Like when we're doing planning for feature development, or for prioritization of should we do feature development, or should we work on shoring up the compile servers or stuff like that? It's all very kind of back of the napkin sort of stuff, just sticking our finger in the air and going, which way the wind's blowing. So I feel like if you're running a steel plant that's just cranking out crates and crates of steel, it's pretty fucking easy to measure them. You just look at the things. But there's all kinds of systems in the economy that I don't think are as amenable to this kind of exact analysis. You'd have to kind of fudge the numbers, or invent kind of metrics to help yourself out there. On the topic of case studies and such, we probably need to look at more of the stuff that Raul Espejo wrote later. I think some of his books have more of that kind of in-depth sort of stuff. Plus, he's still alive. We could just email him and ask some of this sort of stuff as well.
Yeah,
that's a possibility.
We should definitely do that.
He's probably the world expert on this stuff, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, before he croaks, right?
Yeah. No. Let's get on that this week. Brett, go ahead.
Oh wait, I didn't even raise my hand. Sorry.
Okay. All right. So that's going to do it for this session. Thank you, everybody. for participating. Next week, we will move on to Chapter 12, probably cover the first half of that. So thank you, and I'll see you next week.
See y'all.
Everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.